number of years ago, I had gotten together with a group of friends from church, and we decided to meet to pray about a problem that we were experiencing. And so we each took turns as we sat around in a circle praying for this problem, praying for the church, just trying to figure out a solution. It was not something that was easy. It was not something that we could just readily fix on our own, and we knew that we really needed God's help. So as we sat there praying, I don't know why, I can't explain it, but it just felt like someone was behind me kind of gently pushing on my back. I know that's weird. And there was nobody there, but it just felt that way. And to the point where I even leaned forward. That's how weird it felt. And we were still praying, and there's more gentle pushing on my back, so I leaned forward further, and eventually I got so far up to the edge of my chair, I couldn't lean any further without falling onto the floor. And so I just decided, well, maybe I should sit down on the floor, which is even weirder than just leaning forward. But I'm with a group of friends right now, and I don't want them to think that I'm any more of a weirdo than they already do. So I thought, well, I should explain to them, I don't know why, this is just what I feel, and so I'm going to sit down here. And they were like, okay, that's fine. And we kept praying. And then I heard a voice. And it wasn't any person in the room. The voice said 3 words. And I had no rational explanation for what was happening to me in that moment. The words that I heard were, "You're not alone." And I believe that this was the voice of God, that through His Spirit somehow He was enabling me to hear Him, not to imagine Him, not to read something that He had written, not to hear from Him through another person, but to hear Him. And I didn't really grasp all of what was going on. But I knew that God had already promised that He would be with us. You're not alone. Okay, well, Lord, You told us that we wouldn't be alone. You told us that You were faithful, You were dependable, that You would never abandon us. So I knew about that promise, but something about hearing those words, "You're not alone," had this profound impact upon me. An impact upon my thinking and my decisions and the steps that I took thereafter trying to obey God in the midst of this problem that we were praying about. Have you ever heard the voice of God, or what you think is the voice of God, out loud? Anybody? Look at that. Look around the room. Wow. Maybe the short version, if you're willing. Anybody that put up your hand, what did you hear? If you're willing, just speak loud enough for people to hear. What did you hear?
I will take care of it.
I will take care of it. Wow. I will take care of it. Man, I need to hear that sometimes. Anybody else want to share what you heard? Sometimes it's very personal. Sometimes it's everybody needs to know. But if you wanted to share, you're welcome. Say it again.
When Barb Oster's husband was ill, I heard God say, "I am giving Norm everything he needs."
I'm giving Norm everything he needs. Wow. It doesn't always happen, though. I mean, there are times where maybe I want to hear from God. Maybe I need to hear from God. But I can't just conjure Him up. I could definitely use it in my life. I think that it would help in a number of different situations. But it's not like I can just force Him into it. How many of you would say that you've asked God to communicate with you, or you've asked God to speak with you, but that when you asked, you didn't hear a response? I'll put my hand up, because that's happened to me before. You've asked, I want to hear from God, or I've asked to hear from God, and I didn't hear any type of a response. There were more hands that went up that time than the first time around. So what do we do about that? I mean, if we want to hear from Him, if we need to hear from Him, if we're facing life situations where it would really benefit us to hear from him, but we're not, even when we're asking for it, then is there some way that we can maybe increase the chances of that happening? I want to talk with you about a few reasons why, just as an example of like why sometimes we want to hear from him. And you probably know most of these things already. There are times when we're making a decision, to buy a house or to accept a job or to move to a certain place or to marry a certain someone, or if we're ready to have kids, or if we're ready to drop the kids off at the park and never look back. Whatever decision that you might be making, there are times where like, I need God's help to make this decision, and so I want to hear from him. Maybe I need to hear from him. There are times where we need to hear from God because we need an answer to a question. I do not understand this. Or I don't understand something that you said in the Bible, or I don't understand why something is happening in life, or I need some direction, I need an answer, Lord. And so we're asking him, and we need to hear from him. Other times we need to hear from him because like maybe we need to know that he's there. For those who aren't even sure whether God exists, they need God to prove himself, to show, hey, I am real, I do exist. And, for a person in that position, seeking him, asking, look, well, can you just show up? Can you maybe just speak something to me so that I can find out, God, whether I can trust you? I mean, I know that we can trust God, but some people aren't sure of that yet. And so they seek him and they ask of him and they want to hear from him. I wonder if you could hear from God about something. So think about your life right now, or think about the lives of the people that are near to you, the people you love. If you could hear from God about something, I want to hear from God about fill in the blank. What would that be? Is there anybody here willing to share that? Right now, I want to hear from God about fill in the blank. What is that for you? When can I retire? That's a big, important question. A person has worked for years. Kevin, you're working outside a lot. It's hot, and you're looking forward to the future. You're looking forward to some changes. I know that you like your work. I've seen your work. It's good work. But to ask God, when can I retire? Now? Later? Help me find out, God. So anybody else want to share? If you could hear something from God, what would it be? What do you want to hear about? Well, keep thinking about it. Keep thinking about it. There are a number of reasons, I believe, why we don't sometimes hear from God. And so I want to start off this sermon and this sermon series talking about some of those reasons, because I believe that if we can identify what some of those reasons are for why we don't hear from him, that can help us to get through those obstacles. That can help us get past it to the point where we can hear from him. And so I want to look at that together with you. The first one actually is just a quote that comes straight from God's word in 1 Samuel 3:1. It says, "The word of the Lord is rare." The word of the Lord is rare. So just right off the start, reason number one why sometimes we don't hear from God, because he's not always talking. So, it kind of makes sense logically if you just think of it that way. You know some people who will talk your ear off when they call you up on the phone, and you're like, okay, well, I got to go, something's in the oven, and I'll see you this weekend. And then they start up another story. Or you're face-to-face with them. They walk in, and you guys are smiling because you're thinking of somebody right now. They come into the room, and you're like, I need to go this way. Because they're going to corner me, and they're going to talk. And you love them, and you enjoy talking with them. But, man, they'll just talk your ear off. But that's not everybody, is it? You also know some people who, they don't make a peep. Every once in a while, they'll talk. And maybe if they warm up to you, or if they really have something to say, they'll say something. But some folks are just a lot more quiet. And you know people like that, too. God doesn't always talk. And to be fair, neither do we, right? Some of us will talk in our sleep, but some of us won't talk as much as the person sitting next to us. We don't talk all the time, and neither does he. So this quote that you see on the screen there from 1 Samuel 3:1, it says, "The word of the Lord is rare." This quote is actually written describing a time from the 11th century BC. So, approximately 3,000 years ago. We have to rewind the calendar a few times. And Even though it's a description of something that was from so long ago, am I the only one feeling like that's still kind of true sometimes today? Do you feel that way? Like, yeah, maybe people hear from him, or maybe I hear from him, but it's not every 5 minutes. It might not even feel like every day. It might not even feel like every year sometimes. The word of the Lord is rare. Not just 3,000 years ago, but it kind of feels that way today. Well, there are times when God's communicating with us when he uses messengers. And those messengers have a title. It's a title that has some baggage with it. So I want to talk a little bit about the title and maybe try to separate it a little bit from the baggage. The title is prophet, all right? We're talking about messengers from God, and we call them prophets. A lot of times when we think about prophets, we think about people who predict the future. And a prophet could do that, but that's not the only thing that a prophet does. A prophet's job is to relay a message from one person to another person or group. So, for example, if I were to send my son Simon to our next door neighbors, and I said, hey, Si, go tell Bob that he forgot to close the gate by their pool. It's a safety issue. Go tell Bob. And then Simon walks over to the neighbors and says, hey, Bob, Dad asked me to tell you, you forgot to close the gate by the pool. And in that moment, Simon would be acting as my prophet. You get it? Because he's relaying a message from me to Bob. It's not Simon's words, it's my words. I'm the one who said, you forgot to close the gate. But he's the one who delivered that message. So he would be a prophet of Dad, or a person could be a prophet of God if they were relaying a message from God. Now, sometimes those messages do include predictions of the future. Sometimes God would ask the prophet, deliver a message about what's about to happen or what's going to happen way later. So it includes predictions of the future, but that's not the only thing a prophet does. And one prophet in particular is pretty famous. His name is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is famously known for having a really tough job. The reason why Jeremiah's job as a prophet was so difficult was he knew, God told him, and Jeremiah knew up front that people were not going to listen to the messages that Jeremiah delivered to them. God had said to him, hey, I want you to go and pass on these messages, but when you do, they're not going to listen. And they're not messages from Jeremiah, they're messages from God. So actually, I want to look at one of these texts with you. If you have a Bible or can borrow a Bible, head over to Jeremiah, and we're going to be in Jeremiah chapter 7. If you split your Bible like right in half, you're probably in Isaiah or Psalms. If you go like right down the middle, then you usually wind up somewhere around Isaiah. Head to the right, closer to the back, and you will hit Jeremiah from that point. So we're going to look just at a couple lines here in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 7, starting in verse 26, then I want to look together at that with you. And this is what God is saying to Jeremiah about Jeremiah passing a message along. In verse 26, God says this: they did not listen to me or pay attention. They were stiff-necked and did more evil than their ancestors. And when you tell them all this, so you, Jeremiah, when you tell them, the people I'm sending the message to, when you tell them all this, they will not listen to you. When you call to them, they will not answer. Therefore say to them, this is the nation that has not obeyed the Lord its God or responded to correction. Truth has perished. It has vanished from their lips. So Jeremiah, I got a message for you, but FYI, when you deliver it, they're going to reject that message. Don't take it personally. And this is the message that God sent for Jeremiah to deliver. Not a fun job, not an easy thing for him to do. And these people that Jeremiah was speaking to, they could physically hear. There was nothing wrong with their ears. They were able to hear, but they were choosing to ignore, willfully choosing to reject that message and then prioritize other voices or other messages over the communication from God. And when they were doing that, it ended up leading to really severe consequences. Like, enemy came, attacked, wrecked the city, destroyed the temple, captured people, hauled them off into captivity, into exile, because they didn't listen to the message that God asked Jeremiah to deliver to them. So that's a really big deal. And this is an example of another reason why sometimes we don't hear from God. We started with, well, because the word of the Lord is rare. Why don't I hear from God? Because his word is rare. The second reason here is because we just don't listen sometimes, right? And if we're honest, we might have to humble ourselves a little bit, but we kind of act like those people that God was speaking to Jeremiah about. And he's saying, they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to listen to God. And that's us sometimes. We're not going to listen to God. When I was little, my mom would call me sometimes to come and do something. And I don't even remember what, but I mean, you just imagine my mom calling out, Stephen, come here, I need you to do something. And I would just keep right on driving my Hot Wheels, like the screeching tires and the roaring engines and the fake crashes. And my mom would call and ask me to come, and I'm still driving my Hot Wheels. And she would call and ask me to come, and I'm still driving my Hot Wheels. So what did my mom do? She took me to the doctor to have my hearing checked. That's benefit of the doubt, Mom. So the doc checks me out. He performs some tests. He looks in my ears. He does something with like noise and just trying to figure out if there's anything wrong with my hearing. And then he turns to my mother to give the diagnosis. And he says, Mom, your son has selective hearing. For me, I think it's pretty great to have a doctor's excuse not to have to listen to certain people. No, that's not what that meant. That's not what that meant. I could hear her, but I wasn't listening. And that's the reason why sometimes we don't hear from God, because we're just not listening. We got to flip a little in our Bibles. I kind of hate going back and forth from one place to another, but I really want you to track along with me if you can. We're headed over to the New Testament, to the book of John, so if you want to start on your way there, that's fine. We'll look at John 12 here in just a minute. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, Corinthians. You're headed towards John. So in this text that we'll look at, another example here, Jesus is speaking with his friends. He's speaking with the disciples, and he's telling them, I am about to die. If you know anything about Jesus, you kind of know how the story unfolds. But for them, they hadn't read that book yet. They hadn't listened to those sermons yet. They're just hearing him say, I'm going to die here pretty soon. Imagine hearing your friend, or the one that you trust to be your Savior, saying, I'm about to bite the dust. This was not an easy thing for them to hear. And so, I got to head there too. I told you guys to turn your pages, and then I didn't do it. John, there we go. Chapter 12. So Jesus is speaking with them about how he is about to die, and then he says this starting in verse 23. Look there with me. Verse 23, Jesus said, the hour has come for the Son of Man, that's the title he used to describe himself, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. That's a very Bible-ish, churchy kind of a word, which is kind of like saying to be made famous. It doesn't always mean that, but in this instance, you can think of him saying, it's time for me to get famous by what I'm about to do. What's he about to do? He just said he's going to die. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about it, so it worked. So again, verse 23, the hours come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. Think about it with me. If I've got a kernel of wheat in my hand and I never plant that in the ground, then I still have just one kernel of wheat in my hand. It's just one seed. If I plant that in the ground, then it can turn into lots of wheat. But as long as I don't, as long as it's in my hand or my pocket or wherever, then it's just that one. So he keeps speaking there partway through verse 24. It remains only a single seed, but if it dies, it produces many seeds. Verse 25, anyone who loves their life will lose it. Remember the context. Jesus just talked about how he was going to die, and now he's talking about how it's almost like the kernel of wheat dies, because look, he gets put into the ground like a dead body does. And then he says anyone who loves their life is going to lose their life. And he says, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Verse 26, whoever serves me must follow me. Follow me where? Where's he going? Where's Jesus headed? He's headed to die. He's headed to death, to the cross. Anyone who serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant will also be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Verse 27, Jesus says, now my soul is troubled. Duh. Okay, because he's talking about how he's going to die. He's not looking forward to this. He loves us. He chose to die for us. But that was not a fun circumstance for him. It was horrible. And so he says, my soul is troubled. Inside, I am a wreck. And then he says this question, what shall I say? Shall I say, Father, save me from this hour? Like, what do you think? I'm freaking out about what's about to happen, so should I ask God, like, make it not happen? Make it so that I can avoid the cross? Should I ask God to save me from what's about to happen here? And then he answers his own question. How does he answer it? Should I ask God to help me escape the cross? He says, no. No, he answers his own question. No, it was for this very reason that I came to this hour. And then that next phrase right there, Father, glorify your name. So we have Jesus recognizing he's about to die. He's not looking forward to it. He doesn't want to do it, but he's not going to try to avoid it. He's willing to do that because that was the plan that he had agreed to with the Father. And he's going to choose to make God famous, his Father, so that by obeying this plan, obeying the decision to go to the cross, to pay the penalty for your sin and mine and for the sin of the world, then God would become famous. He says, Father, glorify your name. Then, look at it with me, partway through verse 28. See that with me there. Then a voice, a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it and will glorify it again. The crowd that was there and heard it said, it thundered. Was it thunder? No. But that's what they thought. They heard the voice of God speaking to them audibly. But they're like, what? I think it was thunder. Andy and I were actually here last night. Andy Wagner and I were here in the evening. And when we were outside, I could hear this boom, boom. And I said to him, I think maybe that's thunder. And I wasn't exactly sure. Either that or like a giant cave troll playing a drum like in Lord of the Rings. But this really loud boom. And so they hear the voice of God and they think, oh, maybe it's thunder, some of them said, that it had thundered. And then others, it says here in verse 29, others said an angel had spoken to him. This was the voice of God, but a lot of people, most of them, just thought that it was thunder. And some of them thought, well, maybe it was like some sort of angelic being. But it wasn't. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't an angel. It wasn't a cave troll. It was God. And that brings me to a third reason why sometimes we don't hear from him. Remember, I want to share these reasons with you so that we can get through them, so that we can get past them, so that we can hear from God. First reason, the word of the Lord is rare. The word of the Lord is rare. Second reason, we don't listen sometimes. I know sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't listen. Third reason right here, we don't recognize. Was that thunder? Was that luck? Maybe it was just like, my friends giving me some good advice or circumstance. Maybe it's chance or fortune. And it's the voice of God, but sometimes we don't recognize that it's God communicating with us. So there's a third reason for us about why sometimes we don't hear from God. In the Old Testament, you've got the Israelite people who were slaves in Egypt. Big famous story, big famous part of the Bible in the book of Exodus. Once they are set free from slavery, 10 plagues, Pharaoh let my people go, they get out, they go visit the mountain, God gives them the 10 commandments, and then they're wandering around in the desert, and they're on their way to go to this land that God had promised to them. This is a fast-forward version of like 7 books of the Bible in 30 seconds. They're on their way into the land. Joshua is leading the people here, and the reason why God is giving them this land is so that they can bless the people of the entire world. He explained this to them clearly and repeatedly, not so that they could get rich and have a great place to live, but so that they could bring blessing to the entire world. And Joshua is telling all of the Israelite people, Okay, you guys get this spot, you guys get that spot, you guys are going to be over there, explaining how the different groups or tribes of the people would land in one place or another so you could live close to others who were in your tribe. And the tribe of Gad was given a city, among other places, but was given a city called Ramoth, Ramoth, Ramoth. And Ramoth was a pretty exciting place. It was like right on the border between Israel and Aram, A-R-A-M, and it sat up on a hill. So as far as fortification goes, that's a pretty good place to be. If you're at war with enemies, you want to make sure that there are strong walls and that you're ready to protect yourself because enemies are going to come in and they're going to try and wreck the joint, steal your stuff, and mess with your dog and all that good stuff. So they wanted to control it. They wanted to fortify it. Also, it was filled with great agriculture, had really rich resources, and it was the place where the Lord had said that the Levites could live. So that included the priests, right? You guys get to live here in Ramoth, an important city. It shows up again a little while later in 1 Kings 22. I want to look at that with you. So go ahead and start turning over to 1 Kings 22. It's like 4 centuries later when Ramoth, the city Ramoth, shows up again. 1 Kings 22 is what I want to show you. So you got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. You're headed for 1 Kings. It's like a fourth of the way into the Bible. And we're going to look at chapter 22. So head on over there. And then that's the last time I'm going to ask you to turn pages, I promise. Until next week. So Ramoth shows back up again in the history books. At this point, they had already experienced the time where they had the judges. They had already experienced the establishment of the monarchy. So they got some kings, and the kings are doing some good stuff and some not good stuff. And now Ramoth shows up 1 Kings 22. And at this time, here in 1 Kings 22, Ramoth is not controlled any longer by Israel. Aram had seized it from them, had attacked and taken control. So Aram's got control of Ramoth. And the king, Ahab, the king of Israel, goes to Jehoshaphat. He's the king of Judah. So Israel I'm skipping so much history. Israel had a civil war. They split into 2 different kingdoms, so they have 2 different kings. And these kings are talking to each other, Ahab and Jehoshaphat. And Ahab says to Jehoshaphat, dude, I want you to help me to go and attack so that we can recapture Ramoth because I want it back. Does that make sense? Okay, they took it, but it was ours. God said we could have it, and they took it, and so I want it back, and I need your help to go and do that. And Jehoshaphat's like, we should really ask God first. It seems like decent advice, right? If you're about to go and start a war with somebody or pick a fist fight behind the church, you should probably ask God first before throwing the first punch or launching the first rocket. So Ahab calls in his collection of 400 prophets. And he says to them, okay, guys, all right, prophets, I'm about to go and start war so that we can recapture Ramoth. And I want you guys to tell me what God says. God will say, yeah, go for it. Or God will say, no, don't do it. And he wants his prophets to let them know. And his prophets all answered him the same way. All 400 of them said, go for it. Go for it, Ahab. If you go to war, you will succeed. You will be victorious. You're going to get Ramoth back. God says, according to those prophets, if you do this, it'll work. It'll be fine. So go ahead and go. And Jehoshaphat wasn't satisfied for some reason. Even though all of Ahab's prophets agreed with each other, Jehoshaphat was like, is there any other prophet around who might see things from a different perspective here? Because, for whatever reason, he asked for more. And Ahab, I love this part. Ahab's like, yeah, we got this guy named Micaiah, but I hate this guy because he never says anything good about me. Every time I talk with Micaiah, he's always like, well, God's message for you is every single time. So Ahab does not like talking with him. When he's calling together his collection of 400 prophets, he did not invite Micaiah. But now that Jehoshaphat knows that Micaiah exists, that's exactly who Jehoshaphat wants to talk with, because he and Ahab didn't get along real well. Remember, they're kings of 2 separate nations at this point. So he's like, yeah, we need him to come. So they asked Micaiah to come, and the messenger who goes to talk with Micaiah says, buddy, I need you to know, before you go in and talk with the kings, you should be fully aware He has already asked 400 of his other prophets what God says. And they all said the same thing. So, wink, wink, you should say the same thing that they did. Otherwise, so Micaiah goes in, and he's here before these two kings. And what the person who got Micaiah was suggesting to him was, don't be a prophet of God, be a prophet of those 400 people. Can you see it? Okay, because remember, what's a prophet? It's a person who relays a message from one person to another person or group. So don't relay a message from God, but relay the same message that these 400 people were saying. You should agree with them. That's what you should do. So Micaiah comes in, and they're all actively talking about how we should go to war. God says the Lord has announced you're going to be victorious. They're doing these object lessons. Everything's getting really weird because they're all like, I'm a better prophet than you. Look what I can do. I have a flannel graph. I don't know what. But they're displaying that God has supposedly said, go to war. You're going to be victorious. And Micaiah knows if he doesn't agree with them, he's facing punishment or death. So he caves at first. He gives in. And he's like, yeah, okay, go ahead. God says go to war. God says if you do it, you'll succeed. And again, it just didn't sit right. And something seems a little bit off. So the king says to him, really? Is that really what God said? I only want you to tell me what he said. Because it kind of seems like you're telling me what all of them are saying. But I only want you to tell me what he said. And Micaiah, gulp. You asked for it. He's like, God gave me this vision. And here's what I saw in this vision, this message from God. He says, I saw our people scattered like sheep without a shepherd. And he said, if you go to war, we're going to lose our territory and our king. That was not what Ahab wanted to hear. He was most definitely not happy. And this was the moment when King Ahab decided, we are throwing Micaiah in jail. And right before he sends him off to prison, then they have this one more discussion that I want to show you here in 1 Kings 22. This one little last conversation before Micaiah goes off to prison. 1 Kings 22, look there at verse 19. Find verse 19 with me. So Micaiah says this, therefore hear the word of the Lord. So who's he delivering a message from? It's not a message from Micaiah. It's not a message from those 400 other prophets, so-called prophets. This is a message from the Lord. He says, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all the multitudes of heaven standing around him on his right and on his left. Verse 20, and the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that's the king, who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth Gilead and going to his death there? Micaiah is saying, what God said to me was, God had this conversation up in heaven, and he was asking the people around him, identify who it is that's going to go and lead King Ahab to die. No wonder Ahab was frustrated. And so it goes on there still in verse 20. One suggested this, another that. Verse 21, finally a spirit came forward, stood before the Lord, and said, I will entice him. 22, by what means, the Lord asked. I will go out and be a deceiving spirit. It means to trick, to lie, to speak half-truths. I'm going to lead him to believe something is true when it's not actually true. This is what that spirit was saying. A deceiving spirit in the mouths of all of his prophets, he said. So then God gives permission to that evil spirit to go do it. Now's the time. Go and do that. And they go off to battle. This battle lasts all day long. And I really like this story. I think it's interesting. You might want to read it later on today, just to catch way more details here from 1 Kings 22. But they're fighting all stinking day long. And probably no surprise if you're like anticipating without having read or heard this before. You're like, oh, I wonder what happens, right? You can probably guess and figure it out. Somebody shoots an arrow, and it comes and it hits Ahab like right where two parts of his armor meet. It just in that one tiny little spot. That's exactly where the arrow goes, and Ahab dies. So exactly what God had communicated to him through Micaiah. And I don't tell you that story because I think it's interesting, although it is. I think it's a fascinating story. The reason I bring that up, the reason I show that to you is because of the fourth reason why we don't hear from God. So remember, I want us to understand these reasons so that we can get past them, so that we actually can hear from God. First reason, the word of the Lord is rare. Second reason, we don't listen. We don't listen sometimes. Third reason, we don't recognize. Like, I heard something, but was that you, Lord? We don't recognize. Fourth reason, we have a spiritual enemy who is hard at work to keep you and me from being able to hear from God. A very real spiritual enemy who does not want us to be able to hear from God. And he is actively working against you and me in order to prevent us from being able to hear from him. In that situation, God's having a conversation with some spirits, some good spirits, some evil spirits. And one of those evil spirits says, all right, I'll go and I'll deceive Ahab, knowing he's going to go to his death. And the way I'm going to do that is by lying to all of Ahab's 400 prophets, and then they're going to pass on those lies to Ahab, and then Ahab's going to listen to them, and he's going to go off to war, and he's going to die. And that was exactly what happened. Could Ahab have heard from God in that situation before he went off to war? Sure. And in a way, he did, because he spoke with Micaiah, and Micaiah communicated to him, this is what the Lord said, this is what's going to happen, but he didn't listen. He didn't recognize that that was being spoken with authority and actually came from God. But what he listened to instead was the voice of our spiritual enemy, who would love to drown out the voice of God by presenting to us lots of other noise, lots of other voices, lots of other priorities and values and things that seem so good and important and valuable and right. And our spiritual enemy wants you to focus on and hear those things because he knows that if you focus on those things, you're a lot less likely to listen to the Lord. Our spiritual enemy hates you and me. He does not want us to hear from God. And so just in the same way that our enemy, was at work against those people that we read about in 1 Kings, our spiritual enemy is also at work against you and I really want to hear from God. I really need to hear from God. And many of you do too. You're already in a position where you're like, there's something that I need to know. If it's not now, it's soon. I need to hear from God. And the good news is that he communicates. Okay? So hold on to that. He does communicate. But we got to be honest about these obstacles that we're talking about here today. These things that get in the way of us being able to hear from him. What are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about those obstacles? That's what I want to talk with you about for the next several weeks. So we'll talk about that next Sunday. Let's watch this video together.
Where kind of anaconda strategy that Iran has.
Signage there to direct them, to proceed.
But something has to be done because I can't have an event.
With a proven track record.
Exactly.
Right.
So I think that's. But I think that the longer you are in a.
Hey, get in the water! Get in!
I'm just like, get over yourself.
ask any direction on what to do about the job today?
No, actually, I didn't. I don't know what the deal is. It's like God is trying to ignore me or something.